The year 1814 dawned with a pale, uncertain light over England, as though the sky itself hesitated between war's fading thunder and the fragile promise of peace. In the quiet countryside of Wiltshire, where frost still clung to hedgerows and thin ribbons of mist curled across the fields, the ancient estate of Ashcombe Manor stood as a testament to better days. Its stone walls bore the melancholic beauty of decline, cracked, ivy-choked, and whispering with memories of a lineage slowly slipping into obscurity. Within its draughty corridors moved Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, the eldest daughter of a baronetcy that had grown too proud to admit poverty and too weary to climb back to comfort. At 28, she carried herself with a dignity that no ballroom crown, no suitor's flattery, and no whispered criticism could diminish. Yet for all her strength, she felt the weight of her family's desperation with every quiet breath she took. Eleanor's sisters, brilliant in their youth and beauty, had already secured their places in society. Each had married well, one to a viscount with a talent for political maneuvering, another to a jovial Irish lord whose estates overflowed with new money. They were adored, admired, and occasionally envied. Eleanor had celebrated their triumphs with sincere affection, but society's gaze had begun to slide past her as if she were a portrait whose colors had faded a touch too early. Suitors had once courted her, but as years passed and her dowry dwindled, invitations grew sparse and admiration turned to polite disregard. Now she was spoken of in the tones reserved for those who had missed their chance, as though happiness were granted by season and not by heart. Her father, Sir Edmund Ashcombe, had always been a man who believed deeply in appearances. Even as debts piled like shadows behind the estate's closed doors, he insisted on maintaining the illusion of stability. And so, when the wealthy Earl of Weybridge, a man old enough to have sired Eleanor rather than marry her, proposed a union that would erase Ashcombe's financial burdens, Sir Edmund clasped the opportunity with trembling relief. The arrangement was presented to Eleanor as though it were an honor, a practical salvation, a sensible duty for a daughter of her age and circumstance. She accepted the announcement with a poised silence that masked the storm inside her chest. Eleanor harbored no childish fantasies of sweeping romance, yet she yearned for a life she could inhabit without shrinking. The Earl offered security, but his cold, acquisitive gaze told her she would be nothing more than a convenient ornament in his echoing halls. His letters, though impeccably composed, lacked warmth. His visits were short, his questions mechanical, his compliments faintly patronizing. In his presence she felt herself reduced to a transaction, a commodity with lineage instead of value. A future with him stretched bleakly before her, a corridor without a single window. For weeks she battled the sinking truth that her father's hopes and her own happiness could not coexist. It was an agonizing realization, but one that settled with a clarity she could neither ignore nor endure. And so, on the eve of the engagement's formal announcement, Eleanor made the quiet, irrevocable decision to flee Ashcombe Manor. She told no one. She wrote a farewell letter to her sisters, her handwriting steadier than her pulse. She explained her choice plainly. She could not bind her life to a man she did not respect, nor could she live a future carved by duty alone. She begged forgiveness, promised love, and asked that they protect their father from scandal if they could. The night pressed heavily against her windows as she packed a small trunk with only the essentials: a plain traveling gown, her mother's locket, a few coins, and a worn volume of poetry she could not bear to leave behind. Her chamber glowed softly in the flicker of a single candle, its flame bending as if sharing her uncertainty. She paused often, looking around the room that had witnessed every version of her life: the child who dreamed, the young woman who hoped, and the spinster who now prepared to step into a world indifferent to her fate. The thought of her father's heartbreak twisted within her, but she steeled herself. If she stayed, she would vanish piece by piece until nothing of her true self remained. Before dawn, the loyal old coachman, too devoted to question her choice, readied a modest carriage at the far end of the estate. Eleanor wrapped her cloak tightly around her shoulders and descended the stairs with careful steps, praying each creak of the wood would remain mercifully muted. The house slept. Not even the servants stirred. Outside, the morning air bit sharply at her cheeks, and the horizon glimmered faintly with the promise of light. She moved toward the waiting carriage, her breath forming pale clouds in the cold, her heart pounding with equal measures of terror and liberation. Yet something pricked at her senses, a soft disturbance carried by the wind. It came first as an echo, a distant rhythmic thudding. Then it sharpened into the unmistakable cadence of hooves approaching at a controlled, deliberate pace. Eleanor froze beside the wrought-iron gate, fear gripping her. She feared a servant had discovered her escape, or worse, that the Earl's men had come early to claim her like property. But as the mist parted, revealing the silhouette of a tall rider on a dark stallion, her fears shifted into confusion and disbelief. The figure dismounted with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to both urgency and command. As he stepped forward, the faint light caught the sharp lines of his face, the stern grace of his bearing, and the unmistakable insignia on his cloak. There was only one man in England who carried that symbol with such solemn authority. The Duke of Harland, Jonathan Harland, hero of Salamanca, a man carved by battle and crowned by duty, stood before her. He removed his gloves with measured calm, yet something urgent stirred behind his gray-blue eyes. Eleanor could not comprehend why a man of his standing would be at her family's gate at the break of dawn, nor why he looked at her with a mixture of relief, resolve, and something deeper she had no name for. "Lady Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice low and roughened by long campaigns and restless nights, "I know where you intend to go, and I cannot allow you to make this journey alone." His words struck through the morning stillness like an arrow. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her. The Duke was the last man she expected to intercept her escape, and the only one whose presence could unravel her fragile resolve. Her mind raced with questions she feared to ask, yet his steadiness held her fast, drawing her toward a precipice she was not prepared to face. She stepped back, lifted her chin, and steadied her trembling voice. "Your Grace, you misunderstand. This is not your concern." The Duke's gaze did not waver. "It has been my concern far longer than you know." And before she could demand an explanation, the mist closed around them like a held breath, leaving her with the terrifying certainty that nothing in her life would ever again be simple, safe, or predictable. The silence that followed Eleanor's refusal seemed to pulse between them, fragile as spun glass. Dawn had brightened just enough to reveal the hard line of the Duke's jaw, the tension in his posture, and the weariness that war had carved into the shadows beneath his eyes. He looked like a man who had weathered storms far greater than the scandal of aiding a lady's escape. Yet in this moment he appeared almost apprehensive, as though the slightest misstep might fracture the trust he hoped to earn. Eleanor swallowed her rising anxiety and drew her cloak tighter around her shoulders, aware that every second spent in his presence made it harder to maintain the distance she needed. "Your Grace," she said, forcing calm into her voice, "I appreciate your concern, but I assure you I am prepared. I have arranged passage, and I will not endanger anyone by—" "You are already in danger," he interrupted, his tone low, not harsh but absolute. "Weybridge's men were on the road before sunrise. They believe you intend to flee north. If they catch you—" His voice faltered for a fraction of a moment, betraying a flash of something dangerously personal. "You will have no choice left to claim." Eleanor's breath hitched. She had expected secrecy to shield her for at least a day. She had not imagined that the Earl would be ruthless enough to send men to retrieve her like an errant possession. The chilling realization that she was being hunted tightened around her ribs. Still she held firm. "Then I shall change direction," she said. "I will not be captured." The Duke stepped closer, the faint crunch of frost beneath his boots punctuating his resolve. "Running blindly on the roads will not protect you. Let me accompany you, Eleanor." Her name on his lips unraveled her composure for an instant. He had never addressed her so intimately, though she had known him through family connections and distant gatherings for nearly a decade. He had always been polite, distant, unreadable. Now, as he stood before her half-shrouded in mist, she glimpsed a depth of emotion she did not understand. "You scarcely know me," she whispered, though even as she said it, she sensed the lie in her own words. The Duke had a way of looking at her, subtle, steady, contemplative, as if he had memorized every inflection of her character long before she ever considered him anything more than a cordial acquaintance. Jonathan shook his head just once. "I know enough," he replied. "Enough to understand that you deserve the freedom to choose your life. Enough to know you should not be forced into a union you dread. Enough to ride through the night to stand here before you." His admission stole the breath from her lungs. She had prepared for fear, for haste, for desperate determination. She had not prepared for sincerity, least of all from a man whose stoicism was nearly legend. Unable to hold his gaze, she turned toward the small carriage waiting behind her. "If I accept your escort," she said slowly, "you must not interfere with my plans. My escape is my own." "I will not hinder you," he promised, "but I will not allow harm to reach you." There was no vanity in his voice, no arrogance. It was a vow anchored in something deeper than formality. Reluctantly, Eleanor nodded. "Very well. But I insist on making the decisions. You may advise, but you will not command." The faintest ghost of a smile touched the Duke's lips. "I shall attempt restraint." They mounted their respective conveyances, Eleanor into the plain carriage, the Duke onto his horse, and slipped quietly onto the road that wound away from Ashcombe Manor. The landscape unfurled around them, frost-silvered hedges, leafless oaks stretching their branches like solemn sentinels, and the river glinting faintly between pockets of morning fog. The Duke rode beside her window, close enough that she felt protected but far enough to respect her fragile autonomy. As miles passed beneath the horse's steady gait, Eleanor observed him with growing curiosity. Jonathan Harland carried himself with an uncompromising discipline, every movement deliberate, almost economical. Yet beneath his martial self-control, she sensed a man profoundly altered by what he had witnessed on foreign soil. He scanned the horizon often, not with paranoia but with a soldier's ingrained vigilance. His presence was a shield, but it was more than that. It was watchful, quietly devoted, almost grief-tinged. Eventually, when the fog thickened and the road narrowed, the Duke signaled for the carriage to halt beside a copse of winter oaks. Eleanor stepped out, gathering her skirts to avoid the icy mud. The air was sharp, scented faintly with wood smoke from a distant cottage. Jonathan approached her with the respectful distance he maintained so carefully. "We cannot continue on this road," he said. "Weybridge's men will expect you to take the main northern route." "How do you know this?" she asked. "Because it is what I would do," he replied simply. "And because one of his riders passed through the last village ahead of us." The innkeeper recognized his colors. Eleanor shivered despite herself. "Then where do you propose we go?" "Southwest," he answered. "Through the forest and onto the older Roman road. Slower, rougher, but unmonitored." She hesitated. "And afterward?" "Wherever you choose," he said. "I am not here to dictate your future, only to protect your present." Their eyes met, and Eleanor felt a flicker of something she had tamped down for years, the longing to trust someone without fear of being diminished. She had never expected that person to be a duke, much less one whose life had no reason to intersect with hers beyond polite obligation. Before she could speak, the distant thunder of hooves broke the stillness. Eleanor's pulse surged. Jonathan moved instantly, placing himself between her and the road, his hand on the hilt of the sword at his side. The sound drew nearer, 2 riders, then 3. "Into the trees," he instructed softly. "Stay low, stay silent." She obeyed, slipping behind a thick oak as the Duke remained exposed, his posture deceptively relaxed, his eyes narrowed. The riders appeared moments later, searching, muttering, unaware of how close they were. They passed without slowing, their urgency palpable. Only when the last echo faded did Eleanor emerge, shaken but unhurt. You see, Jonathan murmured. You are not safe alone. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her fear giving way to grudging acknowledgement. Perhaps not. But I did not expect safety. Only freedom. You may have both, he said. She looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time saw not just a protector but a man carrying truths he had not yet spoken. The realization unsettled her, not because it frightened her, but because some quiet part of her wished to hear those truths. We should continue, she said, though her voice trembled. He inclined his head. As you wish. As they returned to the road, the mist thickened again, veiling the path ahead. Eleanor felt the question she dared not ask hovering unspoken between them. Why, of all people, had he come for her? The answer remained unvoiced, but in the Duke's steadfast silence, she sensed the beginning of something that neither of them yet understood, something powerful enough to change the course of both their lives. By the time Eleanor and the Duke reached the outskirts of Harland Hall, the winter sun had begun its slow descent, casting long amber shadows over the frost-laden grounds. What rose before her was not the imposing fortress she expected from England's most powerful duke, but a sprawling ancestral home softened by age and care. Stones warmed by centuries, windows ablaze with welcoming light, and the faint scent of burning cedar drifting through the air, all of it struck Eleanor with a strange ache. She had not intended to seek sanctuary in any man's home, least of all his, but exhaustion and the relentless pursuit of Weybridge's riders had left her with few alternatives. Jonathan dismounted and extended a steady hand to her as she stepped down from the carriage. The gesture was courteous, not possessive, yet Eleanor felt her pulse tighten at the quiet assurance of his touch. No one will follow you here, he murmured. Harland Hall is well guarded. I did not ask you to give me shelter, she replied, though her voice lacked its usual edge. You did not have to. His tone was gentle but resolute. Inside, the hall glowed with the warmth of low-burning hearths. Eleanor's gaze swept across polished wood, portraits softened by candlelight, and servants who moved with discreet efficiency. None stared. None whispered. Their deference toward the Duke extended to her without question, as though her presence by his side required no justification. It unsettled her more than open curiosity would have. She had been invisible for so long that such effortless respect felt almost unearned. Jonathan guided her to a small withdrawing room overlooking the frozen gardens. He brought her tea, insisted she warm herself by the fire, and dismissed the servants with a nod. Only when they were alone did Eleanor sense the unspoken tension in him, a conflict he tried and failed to conceal behind his composed exterior. You are safe, he said again, though the words sounded less like reassurance and more like a pledge to himself. Safety is temporary, she answered. Once word spreads of my disappearance, my father will demand my return. And Weybridge, he will not surrender easily. I have embarrassed him. Her fingers tightened around the teacup. Men in power do not forgive that. Jonathan's expression darkened. Power does not give him the right to own you. It does in the eyes of society, she countered quietly. My defiance will not be seen as courage. It will be seen as ruin. He turned toward her, the firelight catching the scar that traced a pale line along his jaw, a reminder of battles fought beyond England's sheltered drawing rooms. You speak as though your fate is already sealed. Eleanor looked into the flames, watching them waver like her thoughts. Is it not? My father is a proud man. My sisters are married into households that value propriety above all else. If I return unmarried and disgraced, I will burden them. If I marry Weybridge, I sacrifice myself. Every path leads to someone's suffering. Jonathan stepped closer, his voice quieter. There is another path, Eleanor. She turned sharply, searching his face for mockery, for pity, for anything that would make this conversation easier to dismiss. But he only looked at her with steady, unflinching sincerity. Do not suggest I hide here forever, she said. That would only worsen the scandal. I am not suggesting you hide. Then what? A sharp knock interrupted her, and a servant entered with a sealed letter stamped with her family's crest. Eleanor's stomach knotted as she opened it. Her father's handwriting, tight and urgent, filled the page. He demanded her immediate return. The Earl, enraged, had mobilized his influence. Rumors had already spread, rumors of abduction, impropriety, manipulation. The letter ended with a warning cloaked in paternal despair. If you do not return at once, you will destroy what remains of this family. Her hands trembled. Jonathan reached for the letter, and she allowed him to take it. As he read, a muscle in his jaw tightened. "He blames you," Jonathan said softly. "He blames himself," she whispered. "And that is worse. You cannot go back to Weybridge." "I cannot abandon my family either," she replied, voice shaking. "They depend on me to save them. My father's debts are choking him. This marriage was his last hope." Jonathan's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. "You owe your father love, not your freedom." She laughed bitterly. "Freedom is a luxury for women with no obligations. I have obligations." "You have a life," he countered. "And what is a life worth if it condemns those I love to suffering?" He hesitated then, as though weighing an irreversible choice. When he spoke again, the restraint he had maintained for years finally slipped. "Eleanor, I cannot stand by while you are sacrificed for another man's debts." She stepped back, suddenly breathless. "Do not make this harder," she whispered. "You are a duke. Your involvement already worsens the scandal. I would endure 1,000 scandals for you." The room fell silent. Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to reconcile the meaning behind his words with the man she thought she knew. "Why?" she asked, barely audible. Jonathan took a slow breath, as though bracing for battle. "Because I have loved you for longer than honor permitted me to confess. Long before tonight. Long before Weybridge. I saw your courage, your intelligence, the strength you hid to keep your family from breaking. I saw you when others dismissed you. And I have prayed for the day you might see me." Eleanor's heart stuttered. She had imagined admiration before, distant, polite, fleeting. But never devotion. Never from a man whose title commanded nations to listen. "Jonathan, this cannot." "It can," he said, stepping closer. "If you choose it." Before she could answer, the door swung open. Her father entered, followed by the Earl of Weybridge and several members of the local gentry, their faces sharpened by indignation and triumph. Eleanor's breath seized. They had arrived sooner than she expected. Sir Edmund's expression was ravaged, torn between relief and fury. Weybridge's gaze, however, burned with ownership, as though she were an object he had retrieved. He addressed Jonathan with thinly veiled accusation. "You have compromised this lady beyond repair. You will answer for." Jonathan did not let him finish. He stepped forward, took Eleanor's trembling hand, and turned to face the entire assembly. Then he knelt. A duke. A war hero. England's most powerful aristocrat. Kneeling before a woman society had cast aside. Gasps rippled through the room. Eleanor felt the world tilt, her vision blurring with disbelief. Jonathan looked up at her, his voice steady, reverent. "Marry me, Eleanor. Not to save your name, nor to quiet their whispers, but because you deserve a life chosen by your own heart. Let me stand with you against all of them." Weybridge paled. Her father staggered. The room held its breath. Eleanor's pulse thundered as every path she had feared, every sacrifice she had braced for, collapsed beneath the weight of a single truth. She had been seen, truly seen, by a man who would risk everything for her. Her answer trembled at the edge of her lips, suspended between terror and hope, as the room fell into stunned silence and the future awaited her choice.